Hello. So I was asked to do this talk just a few weeks ago. I kind of have a triple whammy going on. I was asked to give an update on Colorado Parks and Wildlife. We have over 900 full-time employees in our agency, and so giving an update on what we do is a bit of a challenge. We have a lot of cool stuff going on. So I'm going to try to highlight some of the cool stuff. I have more product than time, so I'm just going to see what I can do. So I'm going to try to cover these topics the best that I can. I'm going to talk a little bit about current endangered species issues and everything I'm trying to tweak towards restoration project. I want to mention the statewide wildlife action plan, some of the research that our agency is doing on restoration, which includes some best management practices, invasive species management program, wetland grant program. If you don't know about that, try to give you another funding source. And then I've got some case studies on restoration work we've been doing over the last couple of years. And if I do manage to blast through all this, I'll talk about some free technology that might help you out in the field. So you probably heard about sage grouse. It's a big deal for us. We've been working on these two species, the greater and the Gunnisons, recently. And the habitat on the west slope looks like this. I'll talk about the Gunnisons first. It was listed in late 2014. And with 1.4 million acres of critical habitat. And because of the listing, the main point of contact, if you are doing restoration work around their habitat, would be the Fish and Wildlife Service. But through some agreements, we're able to continue with monitoring and some habitat treatment work for the species. On the greater sage grouse, they have a pretty impressive range. And I think we're pretty lucky in Colorado to only have about 4% of that down here. But it's still a big part of what we're operating on right now. So very recently, it was not warranted for listing. With this interesting caveat of in 5 years, we're going to reevaluate the situation of that decision. We do have a conservation plan for the species, and we will continue monitoring and conservation efforts and continue to be the main point of contact for that species. So if you're operating within the habitat of this species, you should contact your local state wildlife biologist. And I will say that there's been a lot of cool work done on restoration and riparian areas that really benefits this species. Many of you have probably heard about the yellow-billed cuckoo. It's going to have a pretty important impact on the way we do riparian restoration. And the thing that we're working on right now is the critical habitat designation, and there's going to be a second comment period for that coming very soon. So I'd encourage you to keep your eyes on that process. Here we are in Grand Junction in Critical Habitat Unit 55 for that species. And the species is all over the West, so check out the website for Fish and Wildlife Service and look at the critical habitat designations in your area and think about how the species might impact your work. Consultation is with Fish and Wildlife. And really, from our point of view, biologically, there's probably a short-term impact of a lot of the restoration activities that we're doing. But the long-term gain of that work is by far very beneficial and desirable. Black-footed ferrets are really cool, and there's kind of a neat story behind it, so I thought I'd talk about that real quick. We've been working on the reintroduction of this species for some time in the recent past. It was one of the very first species listed under the Endangered Species Act, actually before it was called the ESA. And so there's no critical habitat designation because of that early listing. Critical habitat came in later versions of the Act. It was thought to be extinct twice, and over time we continue to find other small populations that were hanging on. And And now all the ferrets in North America are descendant from 8 individuals from that last founding population in Wyoming, which I think is a pretty interesting challenge in biology to maintain the genetic diversity of 8 individuals. We have 6 breeding facilities across North America, and the biggest issues that we've had is prairie dog colonies plaguing out. 90% of their food source is prairie dogs, and finding appropriate release sites, large enough areas with appropriate management for release. There have been 7 release efforts in Colorado. The first one in the early 2000s failed because the prairie dog site plagued out. And then starting in 2013, we've started reintroducing them in blacktail prairie dog colonies on the east slope, the Front Range. So this map kind of indicates where some of those release sites are located. In 2015, we've documented breeding in 2 sites, which is pretty cool. So in a matter of a couple years, we're starting to establish some breeding at these populations. And it's only through really amazing collaborations between public and private entities that has made all of this happen. And we really got to tip our hats to some of the private landowners who are allowing releases on their ranches. I wanted to touch base on the swap real quick. The statewide action plan, its real purpose is to kind of help focus conservation of species across different entities. And so this is a great community to present this plan to. We are really identifying the species that we see as top priority or in most need of conservation across the state. We've also added rare plants and a climate change component to the way that we look at species conservation. And I was asked to point out that while we coordinated the creation of the document, that there were hundreds of stakeholders who gave input on that document. Oops. So Danielle's in the room, and I'm going to try not to misrepresent her work. But I wanted to talk about some of the research that is happening at Parks and Wildlife, and her work is pretty awesome. So this is an example of some soil treatments, and in one pass it's able to do the soil treatment and get the seed on the ground. So there's a little bit less resources with this potholing method that she's been looking at. And we're looking at different kinds of seed mixes. The seed mix on the left is kind of your standard seed mix from the White River Field Office. And then the latter mix is a more high competition-oriented mix and a low competition-oriented mix. It's really high in Forbes, which is the blue in the pie. You can also see the size of the charts indicates the number of seeds per area square foot. Really the thing that stands out with this to me is that these high Forb mixes are really able to outcompete annual grasses and annual weeds in pretty amazing ways. And the result being something that we want to see, which is something that looks like habitat and not a field of grass. And so thinking about seed mixes that are high in Forbs being as successful as a standard seed mix that would be more grass-oriented, and with the result being a better wildlife habitat, something that we should keep in mind. And the other thing that's cool about that pothole method from the first picture is that without putting herbicides on the ground, the method really does a great job at controlling cheatgrass by creating microclimates and small habitat opportunities for desirable species. And so when you start out with something like on the left, a field of cheatgrass, and you can end up like something on the right in a span of 2 years just by changing the way that you seed an area and being thoughtful about the seed mix that you use, really maximizes the use of our limited resources that we have to do this kind of work. So the benefit of using the pothole method are that it can bury the seed bank in a way that keeps some of the undesirable species from germinating. It keeps seeds from moving across the landscape, and it can trap seeds in holes where the cheatgrass it might be too moist for, but the desirable species that are down there have a little extra moisture to outcompete the non-desirable species. Pretty good. Another piece of research that we've done is, and Chris Stern was talking about this earlier today, on the Front Range with the floods. And so our aquatics folks have been looking at how to give some guidelines to flood, the reaction to floods. And so, as it's been stated already today, the floods had a really devastating impact on communities, but they really had a pretty positive impact on ecosystems and stream function. In that, we've been holding back these events over time. And so after the flood, there was a real prioritization to put infrastructure back for our own cultural use. But in a lot of cases, this reconstruction degraded the function of the stream and the habitat within it. And so, as is outlined in this paper, in non-mitigated areas, trout abundance was found anywhere from negative 58% to a positive 69%. So in some cases, the trout were pretty excited about those floods and the impacts that they had. But in the areas that were receiving emergency mitigation, the trout abundance averaged negative 95%. And so what this paper is aiming to do is to give some best management practices on, when we're doing emergency flood mitigation work, how can we try to mitigate the negative effects of that work on the stream and the wildlife within. Our Colorado Natural Areas Program has been working with CDOT on producing BMPs for rare plants along roadsides. These are available on our website if you look under the Natural Areas Program. Currently, we have BMPs for 10 rare plant species, and we'll finish 7 more BMPs this year for 7 other plants. And they're covering things like how to treat weeds along the roadway in ways that are sensitive to the rare plants that are there. Helps with species ID of these rare plants. In some cases, they're only found in maybe 5 places in the state, and so it's, as a botanist, it can be difficult to identify them, the habitat that they need, and their distribution. And there's the link to finding them. In Parks and Wildlife, we also have an invasive species mapping and treatment planning program. And with every state park has a weed plan that's no more than 5 years old. And the thing with planning, I really like this quote. I'm a resource planner, and when we jump into stuff about thinking about the long-term influence of our actions, we can set ourselves up for failure and really waste a lot of valuable resources. So I'm asked to cover this whole area, 42 state parks, and getting weed maps and weed plans done in a 5-year rotation. This last year, we mapped 9 parks and covered over 7,000 acres of weeds mapped, with the outcome of that mapping looking something like this map here for individual state parks. We focus on Department of Agriculture's weed-listed species. And the most common species we found across the board this year were these species: Canada and musk thistle, common mullein, cheatgrass, and field bindweed. And as far as eradication and control, Canada thistle, bull, Scotch and musk, and common mullein are pretty ubiquitous, and it's going to be a real challenge for us to eradicate those species from the landscape. These are the different components of that are within the weed plan. So every state park has an outline for how to treat the weeds, how to prioritize the weed treatments to be most effective both biologically and also to use the limited financial resources in a way that can actually eliminate weeds on the landscape and improve the habitat condition. I wanted to mention the wetlands program. We're putting a lot of money on the ground through this program, and this is a great conference to really sell Brian Sullivan's work and the money that we get from GOCO and other resources to put onto the ground. So here's the Yampa River. We have $100,000 on the ground. The Republican River, $150,000 on the ground. I love the before and after shots. The Dolores, $100,000 has gone onto the ground. So annually, at this point in time, we're giving out a little over $500,000 a year. The money goes out to prioritize some of our goals in conjunction with the riparian restoration work, focusing on species of interest, CPW. We give out up to $50,000 in chunk, and you have a 3-year window to spend that money. This is a really cool collaboration we did with, we had city entities, county entities, parks and wildlife. We used volunteers, contract money, and we were able to put over $100,000 of work on the ground without putting any of our own money into it. And it really just goes to show what collaboration and partnerships can really do as far as restoration work. And we have now eliminated all the Russian olives at Bar Lake State Park, which is it's an agricultural field. And really, it's impressive and really cool. And one of the points I wanted to make on that is we're really thoughtful about planning. We're putting riparian forest restoration plans on the ground for these parks. So as we're removing these trees, we can reintroduce desirable native species in a phased planting effort so that the habitat is able to be maintained for wildlife. So if you get kickback on people not wanting to pull Russian olives, I suggest taking this phased approach and putting species on the ground as you take species off, and I think you'll get a lot more buy-in from our wildlife biologists. We've got a bunch of other projects that I wanted to show you guys, but as time runs slow, I'll just kind of kick through these. So a lot of flood recovery projects and really looking at stream function and some of the things that have already been talked about today, restoring the floodplain and making sure that when it happens again, that the stream continues to function and that the wildlife habitat persists. Some before and afters of those projects. And I wanted to get to this one. I only have a few minutes, but there's been some really great collaboration. And this area of the world is really a poster child for great collaboration on restoration. And when you look at this stretch of area that is being attacked with this restoration work, it's really impressive. And it's, from our perspective on our properties, we put over $1 million on the ground, removing tamarisk and Russian olive and putting desirable native species in. And it's only because of multiple partners that we're able to achieve this. And Pete Furman, the local park manager, wanted me to shout out to Tamarisk Coalition. It's really being someone who can step in and leverage resources and create those partnership connections. So even without money, you can come in and create a more powerful project through the people that you know and the collaborations that you can create. Some of the challenges in this area that I found interesting is they're running into a lot of concrete and old cars under the ground, and trying to put cottonwood poles into areas like that has been interesting. And so following up in those areas with like native grass species and native forb species in lieu of some of the other species that we're used to using has been an effective way to address it. And then another interesting thing that I thought was that, with these pole plantings, the cottonwood leaf beetles were coming in, and then you have this challenge of like young and sensitive plants, and how do you treat an insect on these species and create success and maintain the resources that you've put into that project. Am I done? So if you have a desire or a need to collaborate with Parks and Wildlife, I'm more than happy to be a point of contact for you, and please feel free to come up to me. I have tons of business cards, and I just wanted to credit Matt Kondratiev and some of the aquatics researchers, Danielle Johnston for her work on the pothole and the prairie restoration or the sagebrush restoration work, Raquel Wurtzball and the Natural Areas Program and their work with rare plants and collaboration with CDOT, Pete Furman and JT Romansky here in the Valley and their work removing Russian olive and tamarisk, Kathy Griffin on the grouse, Eric Odell is our contact on the swap, Tina Jackson is our ferret contact. Contact Liza Rossi if you have issues with yellow-billed cuckoo, and Brian Sullivan kicking out $500,000 a year through the wetland program. That's what I got.